The year is 1414. Across Europe, 3 men claim to be the rightful pope. 3 different cities house 3 different papal courts. 3 separate armies of bishops, cardinals, and clergy wage war not with swords, but with excommunications, interdicts, and curses that damn entire kingdoms to hell. The Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, is tearing itself apart. And in the small German town of Constance, the most powerful men in Christendom are about to gather for what they call a holy council. What they're really planning is the bloodiest cover-up in church history. By the time the Council of Constance ends 4 years later, a pope will be burned alive, a reformer will be betrayed and executed despite a promise of safe passage, and the church will have rewritten the very foundations of Christian authority. They'll call it the Great Western Schism's end. History will remember it as something far darker. Tonight, we're diving into the story the Vatican doesn't want you to know. The story of how the Church chose power over truth, politics over faith, and how they buried the evidence so deep that most people have never heard of what really happened in that small German town over 600 years ago. Because what took place at Constance wasn't just a council. It was a carefully orchestrated elimination of everyone who dared to challenge the Church's grip on medieval Europe. And the methods they used were so ruthless, so calculated, that they would make Machiavelli himself take notes. Welcome to the story of the Council of Constance, where the Church revealed its true face, and where the price of speaking truth to power was paid in blood and flames. To understand why the Council of Constance became the Church's bloodiest cover-up, we need to go back to 1378, when the Catholic Church first began devouring itself from within. Picture this. For nearly 70 years, the Pope had been living not in Rome, but in Avignon, France, essentially as a puppet of the French crown. The Italians were furious. When the papacy finally returned to Rome, the cardinals elected an Italian pope, Urban VI, but Urban VI wasn't the compliant figurehead they expected. He immediately began attacking the cardinals' lavish lifestyles, threatening to create new cardinals who would dilute their power, and generally acting like he actually believed in the reforms he preached. The cardinals, horrified at the prospect of a pope who might take Christianity seriously, declared his election invalid and elected a new pope, who promptly moved back to Avignon. Now there were 2 popes. Rome had one. Avignon had another. Each claimed to be the true successor of St. Peter. Each excommunicated the other. And Europe was forced to pick sides. France backed Avignon. Most of Spain followed. Scotland, always eager to oppose anything England supported, threw in with the French Pope. England, Germany, and most of Italy stayed loyal to Rome. But here's where it gets truly insane. In 1409, frustrated cardinals from both sides decided the solution was to elect a 3rd pope. Yes, a 3rd one. They called it the Council of Pisa, and their logic was beautifully circular. They declared both existing popes heretical, elected a new one, and expected everyone to fall in line. Instead, both existing popes refused to step down. Now there were 3 popes, each with their own court, their own cardinals, their own armies of supporters, and each absolutely convinced that the other 2 were damned to hell. The situation was becoming a joke. Peasants in taverns would ask, "Which pope blessed your ale?" Nobles would switch allegiances based on which pope offered the better political deals. The Church's moral authority, built up over 1,000 years, was crumbling as Europe watched 3 old men in funny hats curse each other in Latin. But for the powerful men who really ran the Church, this wasn't funny at all. The chaos was exposing uncomfortable truths about papal authority. If 3 different men could all claim to be pope simultaneously, what did that say about the divine nature of papal power? If cardinals could simply declare a pope invalid, and elect a new one who really held ultimate authority in the church. Even worse, dangerous ideas were spreading. In Prague, a Czech priest named Jan Hus was preaching that the church had become corrupt, that true authority came from Christ alone, not from the Pope or the cardinals. In England, followers of John Wycliffe were translating the Bible into common languages and arguing that ordinary Christians could read Scripture for themselves without needing priests to interpret it for them. The three-pope problem wasn't just embarrassing, it was existentially threatening. If people started believing that papal authority was just a human invention, that the church hierarchy was just another political system, then the entire medieval world order would collapse. That's when the most powerful secular ruler in Europe stepped in. Sigismund, King of the Romans, and soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, our crisis resolved. United his own reasons for wanting the papal church meant a more manageable church. A church fighting with itself couldn't effectively oppose his political ambitions. In 1413, Sigismund announced that he was calling a great council to meet in the German town of Constance. All three popes would be invited. All the major cardinals, bishops, and theologians in Europe would attend. They would resolve the crisis once and for all, reform the church, and restore Christian unity. It sounded noble, it sounded necessary, and it was all a trap, because Sigismund and the church hierarchy had already decided what the Council of Constance would accomplish. They would eliminate the three-pope problem by installing a single, controllable pope. They would crush the dangerous reform movements that were questioning church authority, and they would do it all while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate, democratic council acting in the name of Christian unity. The method they chose was brilliant in its simplicity. They would invite their enemies to Constance under promises of safe passage and fair hearings. Then, once those enemies were safely within their grasp, they would destroy them. Jan Hus received his invitation in early 1414. The letter came with Sigismund's personal guarantee of safe conduct. No matter what happened at the council, Hus would be free to return home unharmed. It was signed, sealed, and backed by the word of the most powerful man in the Holy Roman Empire. Hus's friends begged him not to go. They could see the trap being laid. But Hus believed in the power of truth. He believed that if he could just explain his positions clearly, if he could show the council fathers that his reforms were based on Scripture and aimed at purifying the church, they would listen. He believed in the promise of safe conduct. He was about to learn that the church's word meant nothing when power was at stake. The town of Constance in 1414 was not prepared for what was coming. This small trading city on Lake Constance, nestled between Germany and Switzerland, suddenly found itself hosting the largest gathering of church officials in European history. Cardinals arrived with entourages of hundreds. Bishops brought their own private armies. Scholars, lawyers, diplomats, and hangers-on flooded in from across the continent. The population of Constance tripled overnight. Every house, every stable, every barn was converted into lodging. The price of food skyrocketed. The city's infrastructure, designed for maybe 6,000 people, was suddenly supporting nearly 20,000. But the money flowing in was extraordinary. This was the medieval equivalent of hosting the Olympics, the World Cup, and the United Nations General Assembly simultaneously. The spectacle was intentional. Sigismund wanted everyone to see the majesty and power of the gathering. Processions of cardinals in scarlet robes wound through the narrow streets. Banners from every kingdom in Europe hung from windows. The message was clear. This council spoke for all of Christendom. But beneath the pageantry, the real work was being done in private meetings, closed-door negotiations, and carefully orchestrated backroom deals. The council fathers weren't there to debate theology or reform the church. They were there to solve a political problem and they were willing to use any means necessary. The first order of business was establishing the council's authority. This was trickier than it might seem. Traditionally, only the Pope could call a church council. But with 3 popes, whose authority counted? The solution was revolutionary and dangerous. The council declared that it derived its authority directly from Christ, and that its decisions were binding on everyone, including the Pope. This was the conciliar theory in action. For centuries, papal supremacists had argued that the Pope was the absolute monarch of the Church, answerable to God alone. Now, suddenly, a council was claiming that collective church authority was superior to papal authority. It was a theological earthquake that would reshape Christianity forever. But the Council Fathers weren't interested in the long-term implications. They were focused on immediate results, and that meant eliminating anyone who might challenge their version of church reform. When Jan Hus arrived in Constance in November 1414, he was initially treated with respect. His safe conduct was honored. He was given comfortable lodging. He was allowed to celebrate private masses and meet with supporters. Some observers began to think that maybe, just maybe, the council would actually give him a fair hearing. That illusion lasted exactly 1 month. On the 6th of December, 1414, Hus was summoned to what he thought would be a theological disputation. Instead, he found himself facing a tribunal of hostile cardinals and bishops. The questions weren't about his teachings, but about his loyalty to the church hierarchy. When Hus tried to explain his positions, he was shouted down. When he referenced scripture, he was accused of arrogance. By the end of the day, Jan Hus was in chains. The betrayal was complete and calculated. Sigismund's safe conduct promise was declared void because, as the Council Fathers explained, no earthly ruler could guarantee safe passage to a heretic. And since the council had already decided Hus was a heretic, the promise of protection was meaningless. Hus was thrown into a dungeon that had previously held common criminals. The conditions were deliberately brutal. The cell was cold, damp, and barely large enough for a man to lie down. He was given minimal food and no access to books or writing materials. The message was clear: confess your errors, submit to the Church's authority, or suffer. But Jan Hus refused to break. For 7 months, he languished in that dungeon, while the Council Fathers tried everything they could think of to make him recant. They brought in teams of theologians to debate him. They threatened him with torture. They offered him comfortable exile if he would just admit that some of his teachings were wrong. Hus wouldn't budge. He had spent his life studying scripture, and he was convinced that his call for church reform was not only correct, but necessary. The church had become corrupt. The clergy had become obsessed with wealth and power. The gospel message was being buried under layers of human tradition and papal politics. He was right, of course. That was exactly the problem. Because while Jan Hus sat in his dungeon, the Council Fathers were proving his point about church corruption in the most spectacular way possible. They were systematically betraying every principle they claimed to defend while wrapping themselves in the language of reform and renewal. The trial of Jan Hus became the centerpiece of the Council of Constance's first year, but it was never really a trial. It was a carefully choreographed execution designed to send a message to anyone else who might dare challenge church authority. And the message was simple: we will destroy you no matter what promises we make, no matter what laws we break, no matter how many people see us do it. Because in the end, we are the church, and the church always wins. The stage was set for one of the most shameful betrayals in Christian history, but Jan Hus's story was only the beginning. Because the Council of Constance had much bigger plans than just eliminating one Czech reformer. They were about to rewrite the rules of power itself, and the body count was just getting started. The Council Fathers had a problem. Jan Hus in chains was one thing, But his ideas were spreading faster than they could contain them. Every day he remained alive, even locked in that freezing dungeon, was another day for his supporters to claim he was being martyred for speaking truth. They needed to move quickly, but they also needed to make it look legitimate. The solution they devised was as brilliant as it was ruthless. They would give Huss exactly the kind of public hearing he had been demanding, then use that hearing to destroy him in front of the entire Christian world. On the 5th of June, 1415, Jan Hus was dragged from his cell and brought before the full assembly of the Council of Constance. The scene was carefully orchestrated theatre. Hundreds of bishops, cardinals, and church officials filled the cathedral. King Sigismund himself sat on a throne, radiating imperial authority. Every detail was designed to emphasize the overwhelming power arrayed against one lone heretic. But Huss wasn't alone in spirit, and the council fathers knew it. Reports had been filtering in from Prague that his followers were growing more militant. Some were even suggesting that if Hus was harmed, they might take matters into their own hands. The Bohemian delegation at Constance was making increasingly angry demands for his release. The council had to walk a careful line. They needed to eliminate Huss without triggering a full-scale revolt in Bohemia. Their solution was to offer him one final chance at redemption, knowing full well he would refuse it. Cardinal Pierre d'Ailly rose to address the assembly. His voice carried the authority of decades in church politics, and his words were chosen with surgical precision. The church, he declared, was merciful. Even now, even after months of stubborn heresy, Jan Hus could save himself. All he had to do was publicly recant his errors and submit to the authority of the Holy Catholic Church. The list of errors was read aloud. 39 articles, each one carefully selected to make Huss look as dangerous and radical as possible. Some were actual quotes from his writings, taken completely out of context. Others were positions he had never held but that his enemies attributed to him. A few were outright fabrications. It didn't matter. Truth had never been the point. Huss listened to the charges with growing amazement. These weren't the careful theological arguments he had expected. This was character assassination dressed up as doctrinal correction. When he tried to respond, to explain what he had actually written and believed, he was shouted down by the assembly. "I appeal to Jesus Christ," Hus finally declared, his voice cutting through the chaos, "the only judge who is almighty and completely just. In his hands I plead my cause, not on the basis of false witnesses and erring counsels, but on truth and justice." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a man in chains, facing the assembled power of the medieval church, and he was still refusing to submit. Worse, he was appealing to a higher authority than the council itself. Cardinal d'Ailly's response was swift and merciless. The church, he declared, was Christ's representative on earth. To reject the church's authority was to reject Christ himself. Huss was not just a heretic. He was guilty of the sin of pride, placing his own judgment above that of the universal church. The theological trap was perfect. If Hus recanted, he would be admitting that his life's work was wrong and that the church had the right to suppress any criticism of its practices. If he refused to recant, he would be proving that he was too proud and stubborn to accept correction, even when faced with certain death. But Jan Hus had spent 7 months in that dungeon thinking about exactly this moment. He knew the trap they were setting, and he had made his choice long before they dragged him into that cathedral. "I will not recant," he said simply. "I cannot and will not deny the truth of God's word." The reaction was immediate and orchestrated. Bishops leaped to their feet, shouting condemnations. Some threw their caps on the ground in theatrical displays of horror. Others called for him to be handed over to the secular authorities immediately for execution. But King Sigismund wasn't quite ready to complete the betrayal. In a move that was either last-minute conscience or calculated political theatre, he made one final offer. If Hus would recant, even now, even after defying the entire council, he would be spared. The cathedral fell silent. This was the moment everything had been building toward. A man's life hung in the balance, and everyone present knew that what happened next would echo through history. Jan Hus looked around the cathedral, taking in the faces of the men who held his fate in their hands. Cardinals who lived in palaces while preaching poverty. Bishops who sold church offices to the highest bidder while condemning simony. Officials who had multiple wives while demanding celibacy from ordinary priests. These were the men asking him to admit he was wrong about church corruption. In a safe conscience, Hus declared, "I cannot and will not recant, because to go against one's conscience is neither safe nor honest. God help me. Amen." With those words, Jan Hus sealed his fate and exposed the true nature of the Council of Constance. This wasn't about theology or reform. It was about power, pure and simple. The church hierarchy would rather burn a man alive than admit that their critics might have valid points. The sentence was pronounced immediately. Jan Hus was declared a heretic and handed over to the secular authorities for execution. King Sigismund, the man who had guaranteed his safe passage, didn't even pretend to object. But the council fathers weren't done with their theatre of legitimacy. They wanted Hus's execution to send the clearest possible message to anyone else who might dare challenge church authority. So they designed a ritual of humiliation that would strip away any last shred of dignity from their victim. On the 6th of July, 1415, Jan Hus was brought to his final public appearance. In front of the assembled crowds of Constance, church officials placed a paper crown on his head, painted with demons, and inscribed with the word heretic. They stripped him of his priestly vestments in a ceremony designed to symbolically remove his connection to the church. "Today you are taking the soul of a goose," Hus told his executioners, playing on his name, which meant goose in Czech. "But 100 years from now, you will hear the song of a swan, and that swan you will not silence." It was a prophecy that would prove remarkably accurate. Exactly 102 years later, Martin Luther would nail his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, beginning the Protestant Reformation that would shatter the medieval church forever. But in 1415, the Council Fathers were confident they were crushing a rebellion before it could truly begin. They watched as Jan Hus was chained to a stake, as wood was piled around his feet, as the flames began to consume the man who had dared to suggest that the church might need reforming. Hus died as he had lived, refusing to compromise his principles even when faced with the most horrible death his enemies could devise. Witnesses reported that he sang hymns as the flames rose around him, that he prayed for his executioners, that he died with the name of Christ on his lips. The Council Fathers ordered his ashes scattered in the Rhine River, hoping to prevent his supporters from creating a shrine to his memory. They thought they were erasing him from history. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because news of Jan Hus's betrayal and execution spread across Europe like wildfire, in Prague, his followers didn't just mourn, they exploded in rage. The Hussite wars would consume Bohemia for decades, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and proving that ideas, once planted, are much harder to kill than the men who hold them. But the Council of Constance wasn't finished. Jan Hus had been the opening act, not the finale. The Council Fathers had bigger plans, darker schemes, and more blood to spill. Because while Europe reeled from the news of Hus's execution, another reformer was already traveling toward Constance, carrying his own promise of safe conduct and his own dangerous ideas about church reform. Jerome of Prague had been Jan Hus's closest friend and ally. He had helped spread the reform movement throughout Bohemia, and despite knowing exactly what had happened to Hus, Despite seeing how worthless the Church's promises were, Jerome was coming to Constance anyway. The Council Fathers must have thought it was Christmas morning. One heretic down, another walking straight into their trap. But Jerome of Prague would prove to be a very different kind of victim than they expected, and the lessons learned from burning Jan Hus would make their handling of Jerome even more calculated, even more brutal, and ultimately even more revealing of the Church's true nature. The bloodiest cover-up in Church history was just getting started. Jerome of Prague wasn't supposed to come to Constance. After Jan Hus's execution, any rational person would have stayed as far away from that death trap as possible. But Jerome wasn't just any person. He was a brilliant scholar, a charismatic speaker, and most dangerously for the Church, he was absolutely convinced that truth would triumph over political manipulation. Jerome had studied at Oxford, where he'd absorbed the dangerous ideas of John Wycliffe. He'd travelled to Paris, where he debated the greatest theological minds of his generation. He was everything the Council Fathers feared most, an intellectual who could match them argument for argument, and who had the rhetorical skills to expose their hypocrisy in front of the entire Christian world. When news of Hus's death reached Prague, Jerome's friends physically restrained him from immediately riding to Constance to confront the council. They knew it would be suicide, but Jerome saw it differently. In his mind, Hus had died because he'd gone to Constance alone, without sufficient support or preparation. Jerome believed he could succeed where his friend had failed. He was about to learn that the Council Fathers had spent months perfecting their methods of elimination. Jerome arrived in Constance in April 1416, nearly a year after Hus's execution. But unlike his predecessor, Jerome didn't come quietly. He posted written challenges on church doors throughout the city, demanding public debates with the council's theologians. He distributed copies of his writings, complete with detailed refutations of the charges that had been brought against Hus. Most provocatively, he openly declared that Jan Hus had been murdered by corrupt church officials who feared the truth he represented. Jerome wasn't just defending Reform theology, he was directly accusing the Council Fathers of judicial murder. The reaction was swift and vicious. Within days of his arrival, Jerome found himself facing the same rigged tribunal that had condemned his friend. But the council had learned from their experience with Hus. This time, they wouldn't make the mistake of giving their victim a platform to speak. Jerome's hearings were conducted in smaller, more controlled settings. When he tried to present his arguments, he was cut off and accused of wasting the council's time with heretical nonsense. When he demanded to see the specific charges against him, he was told that his guilt was self-evident from his association with Hus and his continued defense of condemned doctrines. The theological discussions that Jerome had expected never materialized. Instead, he found himself facing what amounted to a show trial, where the verdict had been decided before the proceedings even began. But Jerome had one advantage that Hus had lacked. He understood exactly what kind of game the council was playing, and for nearly a year he played it better than they did. Where Hus had been uncompromising in his principles, Jerome proved willing to engage in tactical retreats. When pressed on specific theological points, he would offer nuanced clarifications that made it harder for his accusers to pin him down. When threatened with immediate execution, he would hint at possible compromises while never actually abandoning his core positions. The Council Fathers found themselves in an impossible situation. They couldn't simply burn Jerome the way they had burned Hus, because he was too clever at avoiding the specific legal traps they set for him. But they also couldn't let him go, because his very presence in Constance was attracting attention from Reform sympathizers across Europe. So they did what medieval power structures always did when faced with inconvenient opponents. They wore him down through systematic torture and psychological warfare. Jerome was moved from prison to prison, each one worse than the last. He was denied adequate food, medical care, and access to books or writing materials. Visitors were forbidden. His supporters were threatened with heresy charges themselves if they tried to help him. Month after month, the pressure intensified. Council officials would visit his cell with offers of clemency if he would just admit that some of his positions might have been overstated. They brought in former friends who begged him to save himself through compromise. They described in graphic detail what his execution would involve if he continued to resist. The psychological assault was more sophisticated than anything they had tried with Huss. Where they had simply demanded complete submission from the Czech reformer, they offered Jerome a series of graduated compromises, each one seeming reasonable but collectively designed to undermine everything he stood for. And slowly, inexorably, it began to work. By early 1416, Jerome's health was deteriorating rapidly. The combination of poor conditions, inadequate nutrition, and constant stress was taking its toll. More importantly, his isolation from supporters and access to outside information was warping his perspective on his situation. When you're locked in a cell for months, with only your captors for human contact, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain your sense of reality. The Council Fathers understood this perfectly, and they exploited it ruthlessly. They began bringing Jerome carefully selected pieces of information about the outside world, all designed to convince him that his cause was hopeless. The Hussite movement in Bohemia was collapsing, they told him. His former supporters had abandoned him. Even his family was urging him to submit to church authority. None of it was true, but Jerome had no way to verify their claims. And in his weakened state, surrounded by enemies who held absolute power over his daily existence, he began to doubt not just his chances of survival, but the validity of his entire life's work. The breakthrough came in May 1416, when Jerome was told that a delegation of Bohemian nobles had arrived in Constance to negotiate his release. All he had to do was make a public statement acknowledging the authority of the Council of Constance and expressing regret for any statements that might have been misinterpreted as attacks on church unity. It seemed like a reasonable compromise. Jerome wouldn't have to renounce his core beliefs, just acknowledge that he might have expressed them in ways that caused unnecessary controversy. He could return to Prague, continue his scholarly work, and fight for reform through less confrontational methods. On May 23, 1416, Jerome of Prague stood before the assembled Council of Constance and delivered what his captors thought would be a statement of submission. Instead, he gave them one of the most devastating indictments of ecclesiastical corruption in medieval history. "I confess," Jerome began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed cathedral, "that I have been in error. My error was believing that this council sought truth rather than the preservation of its own power. My error was thinking that men who live in palaces while preaching poverty could be trusted to judge questions of Christian doctrine." The Council Fathers sat in stunned silence as Jerome systematically demolished their credibility. He recounted the promises that had been made to Huss, the betrayals that had followed, the judicial murders disguised as theological corrections. He named specific officials who had enriched themselves through the sale of church offices while condemning others for simony. Most damaging of all, he revealed details of his own treatment in prison, the psychological torture techniques that had been used against him, the lies he had been told about events in the outside world. "You ask me to recant," Jerome concluded, "but how can a man recant truths that he has witnessed with his own eyes? How can I deny the corruption I have seen, the hypocrisy I have experienced, the betrayals I have endured? I would rather burn than become complicit in this charade of justice." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Cardinals leaped to their feet, shouting condemnations. Some demanded that Jerome be dragged away immediately and burned without further ceremony. Others called for him to be tortured until he provided the names of his accomplices. But King Sigismund, who had remained largely silent during Hus's trial, surprised everyone by intervening. Perhaps he was genuinely moved by Jerome's courage. Perhaps he was calculating that another immediate execution would further inflame the situation in Bohemia. Or perhaps he simply wanted to avoid being remembered as the man who had personally guaranteed safe conduct to two reformers who were then immediately burned. Whatever his motivation, Sigismund demanded that Jerome be given time to reconsider his position. The execution was postponed, and Jerome was returned to prison with the understanding that he would have one final opportunity to save himself. It was a mistake that the Council Fathers would spend months regretting, because Jerome used his reprieve not to prepare a recantation, but to orchestrate one final act of defiance that would expose the true nature of the Council of Constance more clearly than anything that had come before. From his prison cell, Jerome began smuggling out letters to his supporters across Europe. Using a network of sympathetic guards, visiting clergy, and merchants who traveled between Constance and other cities, he managed to get detailed accounts of his treatment to reformers in Prague, Paris, Oxford, and beyond. These letters painted a devastating picture of the council's methods. They described the systematic use of false promises, psychological torture, and judicial authority. They revealed the manipulation to eliminate anyone who dared question the church gap between the council's public claims about seeking truth and unity, and their private determination to crush all opposition. Most importantly, Jerome's letters contained detailed instructions for his supporters on how to respond to his eventual execution. He urged them not to seek revenge, but to use his death as evidence of the church's corruption. He provided them with specific examples of hypocrisy and abuse that they could use to discredit the council's claims to moral authority. The Council Fathers gradually became aware that something was happening, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Reports were filtering in from across Europe of increased criticism of the council, of renewed support for reform movements, of questions being raised about the legitimacy of Hus's execution. By the time they realized that Jerome was orchestrating a propaganda campaign from his prison cell, it was too late to stop it. The damage was done, and the council's credibility was hemorrhaging across Europe. Their response was predictably vicious. Jerome's conditions were made even harsher. His guards were replaced with men known for their brutality. His food was reduced to near starvation levels. The psychological pressure was intensified with threats not just against Jerome himself, but against his family and supporters in Prague. But Jerome had already accomplished what he set out to do. He had exposed the Council of Constance for what it really was, not a gathering of holy men seeking to reform the church, but a political operation designed to eliminate opposition through whatever means necessary. Now, all that remained was for him to die in a way that would make his message impossible to ignore. The final act of Jerome's drama would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply refusing to let it break your spirit. And the Council Fathers were about to learn that killing a man and killing his ideas were two very different things. The Council Fathers had backed themselves into a corner. Every day Jerome remained alive was another day for his letters to circulate, another day for his supporters to organize, another day for Europe to see that the great reformers weren't the dangerous heretics they'd been painted as, but men of principle standing against institutional corruption. But executing Jerome presented its own problems. They'd already learned from Hus's death that creating martyrs could be more dangerous than leaving critics alive. The Hussite wars were raging across Bohemia, costing thousands of lives and proving that ideas, once planted in fertile ground, could grow into movements that no amount of military force could contain. The solution they devised was characteristically ruthless and brilliant. They would break Jerome completely before they killed him, not just physically, but spiritually and intellectually. They would force him to recant so thoroughly, so publicly, that his death would seem like divine justice rather than political murder. The campaign began in earnest in the winter of 1416. Jerome's isolation was made absolute. The sympathetic guards who had helped him smuggle out letters were replaced with men personally selected for their loyalty to the council. His cell was moved to a location where no sound could escape and no visitors could approach. More insidiously, the council began a systematic assault on Jerome's sense of reality. They brought him forged letters, supposedly from his supporters in Prague, expressing disappointment in his extremism and urging him to seek reconciliation with the Church. They showed him fabricated documents claiming that the Hussite movement was collapsing and that moderate reformers were distancing themselves from his radical positions. The psychological warfare was sophisticated beyond anything medieval interrogators had previously attempted. They understood that Jerome's greatest strength was his intellectual confidence, his absolute certainty that his positions were theologically sound and morally justified. If they could undermine that confidence, if they could make him doubt his own reasoning, they could achieve something that physical torture had failed to accomplish. Day after day, teams of the council's most skilled theologians visited Jerome's cell. They didn't come to debate or threaten. Instead, they engaged in what appeared to be friendly theological discussions, carefully designed to plant seeds of doubt about specific aspects of Jerome's positions. They would acknowledge that he was clearly a learned man, that his concerns about church corruption had some validity, that his intentions were undoubtedly good. But they would gently suggest that perhaps he had been too hasty in his conclusions, too willing to condemn practices that might have legitimate justifications he hadn't considered. The technique was diabolical in its subtlety. Where crude threats had only strengthened Jerome's resolve, this apparent reasonableness began to erode his certainty. When you're completely isolated, when your only human contact consists of people who seem genuinely concerned for your welfare while quietly questioning your judgment, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain absolute confidence in positions that are leading you toward a horrible death. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jerome began to waver. The first crack appeared in January 1417, when Jerome asked to see a copy of Augustine's writings on church authority. It was a reasonable request from a scholar seeking to verify his theological positions, but the Council Fathers recognized it as something more significant, a sign that Jerome was beginning to doubt his own interpretations. They provided the Augustine texts, but not complete copies. Instead, they gave him carefully selected passages that seemed to support papal supremacy and the authority of church councils. When Jerome asked for access to other sources that might provide different perspectives, he was told that such materials weren't available, or that they had been deemed unsuitable for someone in his position. Cut off from the scholarly resources that had shaped his thinking, surrounded by experts who patiently explained why his positions were theologically untenable, Jerome found his intellectual foundations beginning to crumble. The breaking point came in March 1417, when the Council Fathers played their masterstroke. They brought Jerome a letter that they claimed had been written by Jan Hus shortly before his execution, expressing regret for leading his followers into error and urging Jerome to accept the Church's authority rather than follow him into heretical martyrdom. The letter was a complete fabrication, but Jerome had no way to know that. The handwriting looked authentic. The theological language matched Hus's style. Most convincingly, the document contained personal references that only someone close to Hus would have known. Reading what he believed to be his closest friend's final repudiation of everything they had worked for together was devastating to Jerome's morale. If Hus himself had recognized that their reform movement was wrong, if the man he had revered as a model of Christian courage had ultimately submitted to church authority, what did that say about Jerome's own stubborn resistance? The Council Fathers watched carefully as Jerome struggled with this supposed revelation. They could see his resolve weakening, his certainty dissolving. After months of psychological manipulation, they had finally found the key to breaking his spirit. On the 18th of March, 1417, Jerome of Prague requested an audience with the council to discuss the possibility of reconciliation. The news spread through Constance like wildfire. After nearly a year of defiant resistance, the great heretic was finally ready to submit. The Council Fathers congratulated themselves on their sophisticated approach to handling dangerous dissidents. Unlike the crude methods they had used with Huss, they had managed to break Jerome without creating another martyr. But they had underestimated their prisoner one final time. When Jerome appeared before the assembled council on the 23rd of March, 1417, he looked like a broken man. Months of imprisonment had taken their toll. He was gaunt, pale, and trembling. His clothes were ragged, his hair unkempt. Everything about his appearance suggested a man who had been crushed by forces beyond his resistance. Cardinal Pierre Dailly, who had presided over Huss's condemnation, opened the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. The Church, he declared, was merciful to those who recognized their errors and sought forgiveness. Even now, even after months of stubborn heresy, Jerome could save himself by publicly acknowledging his mistakes and submitting to ecclesiastical authority. Jerome rose slowly to his feet, seemingly gathering what little strength he had left. The cathedral fell silent as hundreds of church officials waited to hear the recantation they had worked so hard to achieve. "My lords," Jerome began, his voice barely audible, "I have spent these months in prayer and study, seeking to understand where I may have erred in my devotion to Christian truth." The Council Fathers leaned forward, anticipating the complete surrender they had orchestrated. This was their moment of triumph, the vindication of their methods and their authority. "And I have indeed discovered errors," Jerome continued, his voice growing stronger. "But not the errors you expect me to confess." A murmur of unease rippled through the assembly. This wasn't the script they had prepared. "My error," Jerome declared, his voice now ringing clearly through the cathedral, "was believing that men who traffic in benefices could recognize spiritual truth. My error was thinking that those who live in luxury while preaching poverty could judge questions of Christian morality. My error was imagining that a council that murders reformers under promises of safe conduct could claim divine authority." The transformation was stunning. The broken man who had entered the cathedral had vanished, replaced by the brilliant scholar and fearless reformer who had challenged the greatest minds of his generation. Whatever psychological manipulation the council had attempted, Jerome had somehow found the strength to overcome it. Cardinal Dailly was on his feet immediately, shouting for Jerome to be silenced. But Jerome's voice cut through the chaos with devastating clarity. "You showed me a letter you claimed was written by Jan Hus, expressing regret for his positions. But I knew Jan Hus better than any man alive, and I know he never wrote those words. Your forgery only proves what I have always known, that this council will use any deception, any betrayal, any crime to maintain its grip on power." The revelation that the council had resorted to forging documents to break Jerome's resistance sent shockwaves through the assembly. Even some of the bishops who had supported the proceedings against the reformers looked uncomfortable. This was going far beyond theological correction, into the realm of outright fraud. But Jerome wasn't finished. For the next hour, he systematically dismantled not just the charges against him, but the entire moral foundation of the Council of Constance. He revealed the psychological torture techniques that had been used against him. He exposed the lies he had been told about events in the outside world. He named specific officials who had attempted to bribe him into submission. Most damaging of all, He provided a detailed analysis of how the council's actions contradicted every principle of Christian justice and mercy they claimed to uphold. "You ask me to recant my belief that the Church has become corrupt," Jerome concluded, "but your own actions provide the most compelling evidence for that corruption. You promise safe conduct, then betray your word. You claim to seek truth, then resort to forgery and deception. You preach Christian mercy, then torture men into submission." The impact of Jerome's final speech was immediate and devastating. Even his enemies had to acknowledge the power of his arguments and the courage of his presentation. Some of the younger clerics in attendance were visibly moved. A few bishops quietly left the cathedral rather than participate in what was clearly about to become another judicial murder. But the Council Fathers had gone too far to retreat now. They had invested too much in breaking the reform movement to let Jerome's defiance go unpunished. The sentence was pronounced with grim inevitability. Jerome of Prague was declared a relapsed heretic and handed over to the secular authorities for immediate execution. Unlike Huss, who had gone to his death with quiet dignity, Jerome was determined to make his execution as politically damaging to his enemies as possible. And he had learned from watching his friend's martyrdom how to turn a moment of defeat into a lasting victory. On May 30, 1417, Jerome of Prague was led to the same spot where Jan Hus had been burned 2 years earlier. But this time, the condemned man wasn't silent. As the executioners chained him to the stake, Jerome delivered a final speech that witnesses would remember and repeat for decades. He forgave his executioners, as Hus had done. He prayed for his enemies, as Christian doctrine demanded. But he also made sure that everyone present understood exactly what they were witnessing: the murder of an innocent man by corrupt officials who feared the truth he represented. When the flames began to rise around him, Jerome didn't sing hymns or recite prayers. Instead, he used his final moments to expose one last piece of the council's hypocrisy. "You burn me now," he called out as the fire consumed his legs, "but the truth I have spoken will outlive these flames. And when future generations judge this council, they will remember not your promises of reform, but your willingness to murder those who demanded that reform be real." The words carried across the crowd of spectators, many of whom had come expecting to see justice done against a dangerous heretic. Instead, they witnessed what was clearly the execution of a man whose only crime had been speaking uncomfortable truths about ecclesiastical corruption. Jerome of Prague died as he had lived, refusing to compromise his principles even when faced with the most horrible death his enemies could devise. But unlike Huss, whose execution had been presented as the necessary elimination of a dangerous fanatic, Jerome's death looked exactly like what it was: political murder disguised as theological correction. The Council Fathers ordered Jerome's ashes scattered, just as they had done with Huss. But they couldn't scatter the impact of his final speech or erase the memory of his courage. News of how Jerome had exposed their deceptions, how he had maintained his dignity even while being tortured and burned, spread across Europe faster than any official proclamation. The Council of Constance had succeeded in eliminating 2 of its most dangerous critics. But in doing so, they had also provided those critics with the most powerful platform possible for exposing ecclesiastical corruption. Martyrdom that clearly demonstrated the validity of everything the reformers had been saying about church authorities. The bloodiest cover-up in church history was achieving exactly the opposite of what its architects had intended. Instead of silencing criticism, it was amplifying it. Instead of restoring church authority, it was undermining it. Instead of ending the reform movement, it was providing that movement with its most compelling evidence of why reform was desperately needed. But the Council Fathers weren't done yet. They had bigger plans than just eliminating individual critics. They were about to attempt something far more ambitious and far more dangerous: the complete rewriting of church authority itself, and the methods they would use to achieve that goal would make their treatment of Huss and Jerome look like acts of mercy. With Jan Hus and Jerome of Prague reduced to ashes scattered in the Rhine, the Council of Constance turned its attention to the far more complex problem that had brought them together in the first place. Three men simultaneously claiming to be the rightful Pope of the Catholic Church. But what the assembled cardinals, bishops, and theologians didn't realize was that their systematic elimination of the Czech reformers had revealed something terrifying about their own methods. They had discovered that judicial murder, when properly orchestrated and wrapped in theological language, was remarkably effective at solving political problems. The lessons learned from burning Huss and Jerome would now be applied on a much grander scale, because the Council Fathers weren't just planning to depose three popes. They were planning to fundamentally reshape the entire structure of church authority in ways that would concentrate unprecedented power in their own hands. The plan they devised was breathtaking in its audacity and chilling in its implications. Pope Gregory XII, the Roman claimant, had already agreed to abdicate, recognizing that his position was untenable. He'd been promised a comfortable retirement and continued recognition as a legitimate pope until his formal resignation. It was a face-saving compromise that allowed him to step down voluntarily rather than be forcibly deposed. But the other two claimants presented more difficult problems. Pope Benedict XIII in Avignon and Pope John XXIII, the Pisan claimant who had actually convened the council, had no intention of stepping aside quietly. Both men genuinely believed they were the rightful successors to St. Peter, and both commanded significant political support from various European kingdoms. The Council Fathers' solution was to use the same tactics that had worked so effectively against the reformers, lure their targets into a controlled environment, then systematically destroy them using carefully orchestrated legal proceedings that gave an appearance of legitimacy while ensuring predetermined outcomes. Pope John XXIII was the first to fall into the trap. As the Pope who had officially called the Council of Constance, he initially believed he could control its proceedings. He arrived in the German city with great fanfare, celebrating public masses and receiving the adoration of crowds who saw him as the legitimate pope working to heal the Church's wounds. But John XXIII had made the same fatal error that would later doom Huss and Jerome. He had trusted the promises of men who viewed honor as a luxury they couldn't afford when power was at stake. The Council Fathers had been carefully building a case against John XXIII for months before he arrived in Constance. They had collected testimony about his personal life, his financial dealings, and his ecclesiastical appointments. Some of the charges were legitimate criticisms of a man who had lived more like a Renaissance prince than a spiritual leader. Others were exaggerated scandals blown out of proportion for political purposes. A few were complete fabrications designed to make him look as corrupt and unfit for office as possible. The systematic character assassination began almost immediately after John's arrival. Whispered conversations in the corridors of power, carefully leaked documents, strategic rumors spread through the networks of clergy and nobles who filled the city. The Pope, who had arrived as the convener of a great council, found himself increasingly isolated as former allies quietly distanced themselves from his cause. The theological trap was set with the same precision that had been used against the Czech reformers. The council declared that its authority derived directly from Christ and the universal Church, making its decisions binding on everyone, including the Pope himself. This was the conciliar theory taken to its logical extreme, a council claiming the power to judge, condemn, and depose the very man who had called it into existence. When John XXIII realized what was happening, he tried to flee Constance. On the night of the 20th of March, 1415, disguised as a merchant, and accompanied by only a few loyal followers, he attempted to escape the city and rally his supporters for a counterattack against the council. It was a desperate gamble that revealed just how thoroughly the council fathers had outmaneuvered him. Within hours of John's flight, King Sigismund had troops searching every road leading out of Constance. The Pope, who had entered the city in triumph, was captured like a common criminal and dragged back in chains. The humiliation was intentional and complete. John the 23, who had believed himself to be the supreme authority in Christendom, was imprisoned in the same fortress that would later hold Jan Hus. The symbolism was unmistakable. Anyone who challenged the council's authority, whether pope or reformer, would face the same fate. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of controlled theatre. The council fathers had learned from their experience with the reformers that public proceedings needed to appear legitimate while ensuring predetermined outcomes. They assembled an impressive array of charges against John the 23, ranging from simony and nepotism to more serious accusations of moral corruption and abuse of papal authority. Some of the evidence was damning. John 23 had indeed sold church offices to raise money for his political ambitions. He had appointed his relatives to important positions regardless of their qualifications. He had lived in luxury while preaching poverty, maintained mistresses while demanding clerical celibacy, and generally conducted himself in ways that made a mockery of Christian morality. But the council fathers weren't interested in genuine reform or moral correction. They were interested in establishing a precedent that would fundamentally alter the balance of power within the church hierarchy. By deposing a pope, they were proving that conciliar authority was superior to papal authority, that the College of Cardinals and assembled bishops could override the supposed successor of St. Peter himself. The theological implications were staggering. For over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had taught that the Pope was Christ's representative on earth, endowed with divine authority that made him answerable to God alone. Now, suddenly, a council was claiming the power to judge papal fitness and remove popes who failed to meet their standards. John 23's deposition on May 29, 1415, was announced with great ceremony and elaborate justifications. The council declared that he had been removed not through human ambition, but through divine inspiration, that the Holy Spirit had guided their deliberations and revealed his unfitness for office. But the real message was much simpler and more terrifying. The council fathers had successfully established their own authority as supreme within the church, and anyone who challenged that authority would be destroyed regardless of their position or the promises made to secure their cooperation. With John the 23rd deposed and imprisoned, the council turned its attention to the remaining papal claimant. Pope Benedict XIII in Avignon proved to be a much more formidable opponent than they had anticipated. Unlike John the 23, who had walked into their trap voluntarily, Benedict refused to recognize the council's authority or appear before their tribunal. From his fortified palace in Avignon, surrounded by loyal cardinals and protected by French military forces, Benedict XIII declared the Council of Constance illegitimate and excommunicated its leading members. He had the support of several Spanish kingdoms and substantial financial resources. Most importantly, he had learned from John 23's fate and had no intention of placing himself within reach of the council's judicial machinery. The standoff that followed revealed the true nature of the council's authority. For all their grand declarations about divine inspiration and ecclesiastical legitimacy, they were essentially a political organization that could only function when they could control the physical environment and manipulate the legal proceedings. Benedict XIII's defiance from a distance exposed the fundamental weakness in their position. They could depose popes who were foolish enough to trust their promises, but they couldn't force submission from someone who refused to play by their rules. The solution they devised was characteristically ruthless and effective. If they couldn't bring Benedict XIII to trial, they would conduct the trial without him. If they couldn't physically control him, they would systematically destroy his political support until his resistance became untenable. The campaign against Benedict XIII became a masterclass in medieval political warfare. The Council Fathers used every tool at their disposal: diplomatic pressure on the Spanish kingdoms that supported him, financial incentives for his cardinals to defect, military threats from Sigismund and other secular rulers, and a sustained propaganda offensive that painted Benedict as a stubborn old man whose pride was preventing Christian unity. Most effectively, they began working directly with the French crown to withdraw support from the Avignon papacy. France had been the primary backer of the Avignon line since the beginning of the schism, but French nobles were growing tired of the costs and complications of maintaining a separate papal court. The council offered them a face-saving compromise. They could abandon Benedict XIII while claiming to support church unity and reform. The pressure gradually became unbearable. One by one, Benedict's cardinals defected to the council. His financial support dried up as kingdoms withdrew their backing. His military protection evaporated as French forces were redirected to other priorities. By 1417, Benedict XIII was essentially a pope without a church, maintaining his claims from an isolated fortress while the rest of Christendom ignored his authority. The council had achieved through systematic political warfare what they couldn't accomplish through direct confrontation. Benedict's final deposition was declared on the 26th of July, 1417, in a ceremony that was notable more for its finality than its drama. Unlike the elaborate proceedings against John XXIII, Benedict XIII was simply declared to have forfeited his papal claims through his refusal to accept conciliar authority and work for church unity. The message was clear. The Council Fathers had successfully eliminated all three papal claimants and established themselves as the ultimate authority within the Catholic Church. They had proven that they could depose popes, execute reformers, and reshape church doctrine according to their political needs. But their greatest triumph was also their greatest vulnerability, because in concentrating so much power in their own hands, they had created a system that was entirely dependent on their ability to maintain unity and suppress opposition. And as they were about to discover, the very methods they had used to eliminate their enemies would soon be turned against them by forces they had never anticipated. The conciliar movement that had seemed so triumphant in 1417 was about to face its own existential crisis, and the techniques of betrayal, manipulation, and judicial murder that had worked so effectively at Constance would prove to be a double-edged sword that could cut both ways. The bloodiest cover-up in church history was far from over. In fact, the most devastating betrayals were still to come. By November 1417, the Council of Constance had achieved something unprecedented in Christian history. For the first time in nearly 40 years, there was only one pope. Martin V, elected by the assembled Council Fathers, now sat on St. Peter's throne with the recognition of all major European powers. The Great Western Schism was officially over. The celebrations in Constance were magnificent. Processions wound through the streets as church bells rang across the city. Cardinals, who had spent decades fighting each other, now embraced publicly, declaring that God had finally restored unity to his church. King Sigismund hosted elaborate banquets where the assembled dignitaries congratulated themselves on healing Christianity's greatest wound. But beneath the pageantry and self-congratulation, something far more sinister was taking place. The Council Fathers were systematically erasing every trace of how they had achieved their victory. The records of Jan Hus's trial were being edited, References to the promises of safe conduct were quietly removed or rewritten to suggest that such guarantees had never applied to confirmed heretics. Jerome of Prague's devastating final speech was reduced to a few lines about his stubborn refusal to accept correction. The psychological torture techniques used against both men were deleted entirely from official accounts. More significantly, the council was rewriting the very theological foundations of what they had accomplished. The conciliar theory that had justified their deposing of 3 popes was suddenly being presented as a temporary emergency measure, necessary only because of the unprecedented crisis of the schism. Now that papal unity had been restored, they suggested, normal church hierarchy could resume. It was a breathtaking act of historical revision. The same men who had declared that conciliar authority derived directly from Christ and superseded papal power were now arguing that Pope Martin V's authority was absolute and unquestionable. The council that had claimed the right to judge and depose popes was now declaring that such actions had been extraordinary measures never to be repeated. The transformation revealed the true nature of what had happened at Constance. This had never been about reform, or church unity, or theological principle. It had been about a specific group of powerful church officials eliminating their rivals and consolidating power in their own hands. Now that they had achieved their goals, they were carefully destroying the evidence of their methods. The cover-up extended far beyond theological documents. Physical evidence was disappearing as well. The prison cells where Huss and Jerome had been tortured were being converted to other purposes. The instruments used for psychological warfare were being destroyed or relocated. Even the executioners who had carried out the burnings were being quietly transferred to distant locations where they couldn't share inconvenient memories with curious historians. Most chilling of all, witnesses to the council's crimes were being systematically silenced. Some were bought off with lucrative church appointments in remote locations. Others were threatened with heresy charges themselves if they spoke too openly about what they had seen. A few simply disappeared, their fates unknown but their silence permanent. The Council of Constance officially ended in 1418, but its true legacy was just beginning to unfold. What had been presented as Christianity's greatest triumph, the healing of the Great Western Schism, was actually something far more sinister, a blueprint for how religious authority could systematically eliminate opposition while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. The techniques perfected at Constance didn't die with the council. The careful orchestration of show trials, the use of psychological torture disguised as theological correction, the betrayal of safe conduct promises, the systematic rewriting of historical records, all of these would become standard tools in the Church's arsenal of control. Within decades, the Inquisition would adopt and refine the Council's methods. Within a century, the Catholic Church would use similar tactics against Protestant reformers across Europe. The blueprint created at Constance would echo through centuries of religious persecution, political manipulation, and institutional cover-ups. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Council of Constance was how completely it succeeded in burying its own crimes. For over 600 years, the burning of Jan Hus and Jerome of Prague has been presented as the unfortunate but necessary elimination of dangerous heretics. The deposition of 3 popes has been celebrated as the restoration of church unity. The systematic use of torture, betrayal, and judicial murder has been erased from most historical accounts. The Council Fathers achieved something that modern propagandists can only dream of. They didn't just win the war, they convinced history that there had never been a war at all. Today, most Catholics have never heard of Jan Hus or Jerome of Prague. Most historians treat the Council of Constance as a footnote to medieval church politics. The Vatican's official histories celebrate the Council as a triumph of reform and unity, carefully omitting any mention of the blood that was spilled to achieve it. This is the true power of institutional control over historical memory. Not the crude censorship of burning books or silencing witnesses, but the subtle art of shaping how events are remembered, taught, and understood by future generations. The Council of Constance proved that with enough time, enough resources, and enough control over the institutions that preserve and transmit knowledge, any crime can be transformed into a virtue, any betrayal can become a necessity, and any murder can be recast as justice. But history has a way of preserving inconvenient truths, even when powerful institutions try to bury them. The letters Jerome smuggled out of his prison cells still exist. The accounts of witnesses who couldn't be silenced still survive in scattered archives. The archaeological evidence of what happened in that small German town still lies beneath centuries of carefully constructed lies. The Council of Constance may have succeeded in covering up its crimes for over 600 years, but the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried or how long it's been forgotten. And when it does, it reveals not just the crimes of medieval church officials, but the timeless methods by which power protects itself, through betrayal disguised as justice, through murder disguised as mercy, and through lies disguised as history. The bloodiest cover-up in church history is finally coming to light. The question is, what other buried truths are still waiting to be discovered?